Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're going to make some fancy boxes for some tiny spaceships. Like everybody else, we're stuck at home these days, which means we're playing a bunch more games. And a new game to me that we've been playing a whole lot of is X-Wing. This is a tabletop game which is essentially a dogfight with these little miniature ships. It's a lot of fun, and one of my favorite things about it is that you can actually add to the game by buying more little miniature ships. The only downside to that, other than that they're kind of expensive, is that they come in these little plastic containers and there's not a great way to store all of your additional ships as you get them. So today I want to make a system of boxes that will allow us to group all of these ships together and let it change over time, because I'm probably going to buy some more. Let's do it. Each one of the ships comes with the ship itself, but also comes with a little bag of pieces. There's some tokens and a stand and some different things. So I want to make sure that these containers can hold all of this stuff, and that means they need to be flexible. Flexible enough to work with any game that has miniatures, not just this particular game. This game comes with different factions, so I think I'm actually going to make different boxes for each one of these groups of ships. And that will give me an opportunity to make boxes out of different materials, since I'm also trying to use this scrap that I still have on hand. Let me show you what I'm thinking as far as materials. I went through the hardwoods that I still have on hand. I've got a piece of maple that has a big crack in it, but it's a pretty good thickness. I've got a couple of smaller pieces of 3/4 inch walnut, and then some 1/2 inch pieces. So I think what I'm going to do is use these thicker pieces and cut them down to be able to make the boxes, which need to be about 2.5 inches tall on the inside. Then I'm going to use these thinner pieces to make frames to go on the top. It'll be separate from the box. And then I can make a decorative top that will snap on, maybe with magnets or something. I'm not really entirely sure yet. But first off, let's get these cut down and just make some simple boxes. I've got kind of oddly shaped pieces, so I'm trying to lay them out and make sure that I can get the outer dimensions that I need for each one of these boxes. I've already figured out the inner dimension, and so I'm trying to make sure that I add the thickness of the material on the outside. I think I'm going to go with boxes that are 8 inches deep and 16 inches long, which is kind of a weird measurement. Originally I was going to go with 12 by 12, but the way that my scrap pieces are actually cut up, I can't get that. So instead, I'm going to use some longer sections and then some shorter sections, and basically have roughly the same amount of interior space. I got all these pieces planed down to the same thickness. I had to joint some of the edges to be able to cut them down into the same size strips. All of that milling lumber stuff is covered in one of our bits videos that Josh did. We'll put a link to it in case you want to find out the specific details on the best way to go about milling your own lumber. And next up, we have to cut all these pieces to length. I'm making sure that all of these boxes have the exact same sizes so that I can just repeat the same cuts on the miter saw. I've got all those pieces cut down, and I want to put some finger joints in the edges to make the box nice and strong. And for that, I'm going to use this finger joint jig. Now, this thing is not necessary. In fact, it's kind of a pain to set up, but the cool thing about it is that it will allow you to make different size finger joints. So you set up a dado stack in your table saw, the thickness of the joint that you want, and then you can set this jig to match the blade. Like I said though, this is not the only way to do it. You could use a router to make finger joints. In fact, you could just use the regular saw blade, but each of your fingers is going to be the thickness of that blade. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You don't have to have a fancy jig like this, but it does kind of make it easier. I just spent about 30 minutes adjusting that jig, trying to get it dialed in, and I tested on the same material. The offcuts are the same pieces that I'm going to use, because the thickness of the material makes a big difference in how these fingers are going to fit together. After a bunch of failed attempts and adjustment, I got a really nice tight fit on these fingers, so now I just have to go back and cut a whole bunch of them. Before I start putting these together, let me point out a couple of things about finger joints. When you're making these and deciding the thickness of the finger, you want to make sure that your total width of your piece is equally divisible by the thickness of your cut. Otherwise, you're going to have like a half finger or a little sliver sticking off the end. So in this case, it was 2.5 inches, and I made each one of the fingers and the cuts a 1/4 inch. So I should have a full cut here on the end, and when these go together, the outside edges of this piece and the next piece should line up just fine. I also made a little mistake here that you should definitely avoid. I forgot to slide down the sacrificial backing piece on my jig, and because of that, I ended up with blowout on half of the pieces. So whether you're going to use a jig like that or do them a different way, make sure that you have something behind the piece that you're going to cut so that they look like this instead of like this. All right, with that, let's add some glue, hammer these things together, and put them in some clamps. All of these boxes are dry. Now they just need some sanding to clean up the corners, but they're looking pretty good. I also took the same material and went ahead and cut down some strips to make a top for each one of these boxes. I went ahead and added some miters to the end of these, and I had to end up sanding a little bit to get them to fit really nicely. An ideal way to make a perfectly fitting top for a box is actually to make the entire box as one closed object, then take it to the table saw and cut off the top panel. Unfortunately, I don't have enough material in this to be able to do that all in one go, so I'm going to make the tops separately. I've got all these pieces cut pretty nicely and they fit together really well, so these are going to be a simple mitered corner. Now by itself, this would not really be very strong, but eventually I'm going to add a panel in here that's going to lock all 4 of these pieces together, and to do that, I need to take all 4 of these side pieces and add a rabbet down here to accept that panel. Usually I would use a router to add the rabbet to each one of these pieces, but the material that I'm going to use for the top panel is actually perfectly 1/8 of an inch. This is Glowforge material for the laser, and so luckily the blade is the same thickness as the material. So I can use the table saw blade and just run these pieces along the fence to make a little rabbet in the bottom of each one of them. I ran all those pieces through the saw, then I lowered the blade, laid the pieces on their side, and ran through them again. And that's to make a rabbet that's intentionally a little bit deeper than the material. That way, when I put this whole thing together, the material is going to inset just a little bit and won't be proud on the underside of the lid. But unfortunately, this is the only piece of material I have right now, and it's not big enough. I'm waiting for the rest to show up. So I'm going to put the tops aside and move on to the inside of each of these boxes. To make the inside of these containers, I'm going to use something I haven't really used since I was in art school, a very long time ago, and that's foam core. Foam core is a great, inexpensive material, especially for something like this where it may change over time. It's basically a really thin foam with paper on each side of it. And because it has paper on the outsides, you can get it in a bunch of different colors. I got black. In fact, I got a bunch of sheets this big off Amazon for just a few dollars. One of the great things about this is that you can cut it with anything. I use a utility knife. You could use an X-Acto. You don't have to have anything special at all, and you can just glue it together into the shapes you want. A lot of people will use this for model making or maybe to build a mock-up of a piece of architecture. It's a really handy material and it's really inexpensive. I've got a piece of this walnut plywood that I'm going to use for the top and the bottom. I'm just going to set that down in there to make sure that the tray I'm going to build with the foam core is offset from the bottom. That way I can inset that bottom panel and this thing won't be too tall to fit inside the space. And now that I've got a bottom panel cut and set in there, I can lay out where I want all of the different ships to be and then start to build some walls in between them to keep them separated. One of the big reasons that I wanted to use foam core for these trays is that I'm probably going to change them in a short amount of time. I'll probably get more of these ships, maybe I'll sell some of them, I don't really know. But by making the trays out of something inexpensive like foam core, I can easily replace them or customize them or change them. And if something doesn't work out, it's not a big deal. In the future, if I ever wanted to use these boxes for something else, I could always come back and build in a wooden tray to go on the inside. But for now, the foam core is going to work really well. When you go to cut foam core, it's really important that your blade is super sharp. You want to use a sharpened or a brand new blade. If you don't, it's going to end up tearing the foam on the inside. It's going to look like this. If you cut with a brand new blade, it will look like this, and it's definitely what you want. Let me show you. I just put a brand new blade in this knife. I'm going to use a steel ruler and make 2 passes. The first pass is just going to cut through the top layer of paper, so I'm not going to push down really hard, just kind of break that surface, and then the second one you want to push down and get all the way through the rest of the material. When you do that, you end up with a really, really nice surface. After about 20 minutes, this is what I have. Now I used hot glue to put all this together, which is not ideal because you can actually see where it squeezes out and it seals the top of the foam. So that's not great because you can see it, but also it's kind of stringy and it gets everywhere, but it dries really quickly. You could also use a regular white glue like a PVA to glue this stuff together, but it's going to take longer for each one of these pieces to stay in place. Hot glue allowed me to move pretty quickly. All right, now I just have to do the same thing for the other 2 boxes. Those foam board boxes will continue to evolve because not only do I have to store the ships, but there's also stands and cards and tokens and a bunch of things that go with them. So those are going to continue to be worked on, but I'm going to set them aside for now because I need to go back to the frames. To get these ready to put in a bottom panel, I need to add a rabbet around the inside edge. And for that, I'm going to use the router with a rabbeting bit. Now before we did a rabbet with the table saw, which totally works, but in this case, I've already got this assembled and I don't want the rabbet to actually cut all the way to the outside edge, just on this inside. So we're going to use the router instead. Now that I've got those top frames glued together, they're waiting for their inset panels, and luckily those panels just showed up. I got some 1/8" plywood to put in there, so I've got a couple of sheets of maple and a couple of sheets of walnut. These are going to be used for the top and the bottom inset panels. So the plan is here to have an all walnut box except for the top panel, and that'll be maple. Then on the maple box, it will have a walnut top. So we'll have some nice contrasting wood there, and then inside that contrasting wood, we're going to contrast it again with an inlay. So the plan here is to engrave the shape that we want in the panel and then cut out that exact same shape in this. This is a really thin hardwood veneer with an adhesive back. And as long as we use the laser to cut out the same shape on both pieces, the kerf should be really, really close, if not perfect. That way we can take this darker inlay and put it on the lighter sheet. Let me get these cut out and I'll show you what I mean. I do have to admit that this is not a perfect fit. I just used the exact same shape to cut out the inlay and engrave in this back panel. And if you wanted those to truly fit perfectly, you would have to account for the kerf of the laser on the inside of one and on the outside of the other. But honestly, this thing looks really good and it is a very, very tight fit. So this thing is just about done. I gotta add the bottom panels to the boxes, add finish to the whole thing, and this is done. Since I used the router to make this rabbet, it has a curved edge. Now you could take a chisel to that and actually square it off and then drop a panel right in. But I actually found that a little bottle that I have is just the same radius. So instead, I'm gonna trace that radius on the outside of this piece, and and then take it to the sander and knock off those corners. Then it'll drop right in place.
All right, I almost got ahead of myself and took these to put finish on, but I realized that I completely forgot to attach the tops. These actually have to stay on here somehow. The plan all along has been to use rare earth magnets. I've got some really small ones that I got locally, and they're very tiny, but they're strong enough if you put them in the four corners and you put a magnet on this part and on the lid, it will definitely keep the top on. So to start doing this, I'm gonna drill some holes in the corners of the box that are the same diameter as the magnets. Then I'm gonna glue those down in. Let me get those in place and then I'll show you how we're gonna get them lined up with the ones on the top. To drill these holes, I'm using a brad point bit, which I would prefer to use anyway, but the reason I'm using it here is because it has this little brad tip on the end, and that will allow me to line it up with exactly the center point that I want on this box and on the top, so that those holes will be exactly the same distance from the outside edges. Now I'm just going to add some CA glue to these holes and push in the magnet. Luckily, it's a really nice fit, and I may even have to hammer it down a little bit. When you're doing this, one thing to make sure of is that you have the polarity so that these things will actually lock together rather than push each other apart. The way that I remember to do that is I take a stack of magnets and hold them like this, and then push one down and slide them off. I keep them in my hand in this same orientation. Then when I go to do the box, the other side, I need to flip that around and then do the same thing. That way these are always opposite from these. The alignment on these worked out really well. Unfortunately, I ran out of magnets, so I have holes for all the magnets, but not all of them are filled yet. And once I can safely go out to the store and get some more, I can just drop those in. Now these things are finally ready for finish, and then we can put them all together. I'm really happy with these things. They actually look way fancier than I thought they would, and the foam core on the inside actually works really well. Now, of course, every single one of these ships does have a 3D printable holder that fits it exactly, and you could always print those and then build these compartments around those holders if you wanted to. But this is just for storage at home. I'm not planning on taking these anywhere, so I'm not worried about these rattling around inside these boxes too much. And even if they did, this is basically paper, so it's not really gonna hurt them. If you wanna spend the time printing those holders for every one of your ships, go for it. Now that I got these done, I think I'm actually gonna go back and make one more just to hold all the non-ship items, all the game pieces, because I ended up with more ships than I thought, and one of these boxes is almost full. If this project gave you some ideas for how to maybe organize something that you enjoy, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. We've also got tons of other types of projects that you may wanna check out, and if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. The only downside to that, other than them, and then I had to use the, All right, okay. In fact, okay. And talk about what we're gonna do. I think I can do that again. I think I can do that better.